Here is an idea. A get-rich-quick scheme, no experience at all.
On the day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper bought a $20 one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle. He paid in cash. He boarded the plane, sat towards the back, and ordered a bourbon and soda. When the plane took off, he handed the flight attendant a note. She put it away without looking at it. She assumed he was trying to give her his number. She was used to businessmen trying to flirt with her. But when the man saw that she didn't look at it, he leaned over and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note told her to sit down beside him, and when she did, the man opened his briefcase. Inside, there were 8 red cylinders attached to wires. The flight attendant took the man's demands to the pilot. When the plane landed, he wanted $200,000 and 4 parachutes. Once the plane landed, the man let all of the passengers disembark, but he kept the crew on as hostages. He demanded that they take off again, this time in the direction of Mexico City. And 45 minutes into the flight, the man strapped the cash to himself and jumped off the plane. Search parties looked for the man and the cash for days, but they couldn't find either. He had just disappeared. It was all over the news, although the hijacker's pseudonym, Dan Cooper, was misreported as D.B. Cooper. He's still never been found. It's been 47 years. 28-year-old Martin McNally was driving with a friend in Detroit when he heard about D.B. Cooper on the radio.
At that particular time, I laughed very loud, and I told my friend that that's not a bad way to make some money.
Martin thought, how hard could it be? If D.B. Cooper could do it, he could too.
I had no experience bailing out of planes. I never put on a parachute, and I never owned a gun.
Martin was unemployed. He'd worked a series of jobs after being discharged from the Navy years earlier. He'd tried a few small-time scams. Once he got busted putting fake quarters into a laundromat change machine. Nothing had really worked out. So he threw himself into trying to figure out how to hijack an airplane. First, he went to the local library.
Spent about 5 hours pulling out books on parachuting and World War II adventures in flying and so forth. And it took about 4 hours to come across the calculation that I wanted. And it was an algebraic calculation to determine terminal velocity. And once I had that, I wrote down the formula and left and went home.
Martin did all of the calculations himself, figuring out how high above the ground the plane should be and how fast it should be going for him to safely jump out and open a parachute. He was most concerned with how long he would have after the jump before he needed to open the parachute. He figured he had about 15 to 20 seconds. The next step was to find the right airport. For 5 months, Martin scouted airports across the Midwest. He visited Indianapolis, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. He finally chose St. Louis's Lambert Airport. He thought it had the worst security. He visited 2 more times to prepare. He bought a ticket with forged Navy discharge papers under the name Robert Wilson. And on the afternoon of June 23, 1972, he walked into the airport, went up to the counter, gave the agent his ticket, and boarded the plane.
We didn't go through any metal detectors at this time. If there had been metal detectors, I wouldn't have been on that plane, period. So I was able to get on the plane and
with a gun.
Yeah, with my I had a sawed-off rifle. It looked like a World War II grease gun, and I had a pistol, and I had a smoke grenade, and I was dressed like a businessman, suit and tie and sport coat, sunglasses. Didn't have my wig on at that time. Sat down, and we took off.
Martin McNally was planning to jump out of a plane 10,000 feet in the air, going 500 miles an hour, and had almost no idea what he was doing. I'm Phoebe Judge. This is Criminal. More than 130 American planes were hijacked between 1968 and 1972. Sometimes there was more than one case of air piracy on the same day.
Anyone could have tried it. Anyone could have tried it. And quite frankly, a lot of people were doing it back then.
During the 1960s, it was most common for people to board planes and demand to be taken to Cuba. People trying to leave the United States to make a political statement, but also criminals seeking ransom payments. Airline companies and the U.S. government came up with some unusual solutions. Pilots flying to any destination were provided with charts outlining routes to Havana, just in case. Hijackings to Cuba were so common that in 1968, Time magazine published an article advising passengers to just stay calm and enjoy the mojitos. It included tips for the best hotels and cigar shopping. The federal government went so far as to consider building a fake version of the Havana airport in Florida, so hijacked planes could land there instead. The Federal Aviation Administration formed an anti-hijacking task force and solicited ideas from the public. The public made suggestions like installing trapdoors, arming flight attendants with tranquilizer darts, and making everyone on the plane wear boxing gloves so no one could hold a gun. The obvious solution was to just screen passengers with a metal detector. But airlines thought the inconvenience of walking through a metal detector outweighed the inconvenience of being threatened at gunpoint 10,000 feet in the air. Airlines argued that increased security would be bad for business. Customers didn't want to wait in line or feel like criminals on their way to vacation. So, on the afternoon of June 23, 1972, when Martin breezed onto his flight at the St. Louis airport, he didn't expect any trouble at all.
We took off and we're on our way to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And about 15 minutes out of Tulsa, the pilot came on the intercom. And he said, we'll be landing in about 15 minutes. So I sat there and I said, this is it. I got to make a decision. If I land in Tulsa and don't pull this thing right now, I'm going to be stuck in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I said, you either pump up your gonads or forget about it. So I asked the guy where the restroom was in the plane and said it's in the back on the right-hand side. So I picked up my attaché case very cautiously and headed to the bathroom, went in the bathroom, closed the door, locked the door, and opened the attaché case, and pulled out the wig, and pulled out the gloves, and then pulled out the rifle.
Martin says he kicked the safety back on the rifle so he wouldn't accidentally fire a bullet into the plane's fuselage. He put on what newspapers later described as a hippie-type wig. Then he opened the bathroom door and crouched down in the aisle at the back of the plane.
And I was waving to the stewardesses, but no stewardesses could see me, did see me for about 3 minutes. Finally, a stewardess saw me and came back, and she was a young lady, and she said, don't hurt anybody. And I said, young lady, I'm not here to hurt anybody. I'm here to give the pilot a message. And I said, take this note and up to the pilot and then come back here immediately. So that's what she did.
What did the note say? Had you written it at home?
Yes, I typed it at home on a typewriter, and actually I had the original and the carbon copy, and by mistake I gave the stewardess the carbon copy, and the carbon copy didn't have the red bold type that was on the original.
So it's hard to read?
Yeah, it would have been a little harder to read, but the pilot got the gist of it. This is a skyjacking. All I want is the money. Here's the instructions that you need to do. Notify the FBI. I want $502,000.
Why the extra $2,000? Why not just make it an even $5,000?
That's spending money. That would have been pocket change.
Martin says his plan was to bury the $500,000 package wherever he happened to land after he jumped out of the plane, and use the extra $2,000 to get back home to Michigan, pick up his car, and drive to Canada. He would come back and dig up the $500,000 once things had cooled down. But first, he had to get the money.
The captain tells the over the intercom, he said, we have a passenger that wants to go back to St. Louis, so that's what we're doing.
Back then, when a hijacker made a demand, airline policy was total compliance. Martin demanded a new seat at the back of the airplane, and a flight attendant asked a family to move to make room for him.
There was a dude, a tall dude, his wife, and he had 2 kids. So the wife got up, moved, the daughter got up to move, and the son, he was about 10 or 11, 12 years old. He got up into the aisle and turned back and looked at me for a couple of seconds, 10 or 15 seconds, and just shook his head, and then turned around and went up to the first class section. And then the old man, the father of the family, he got up and stood in the aisle, and he was about 4 or 5 feet in front of me. He turned around and he was looking at me, and I was looking at him. I was staring at him. I didn't blink, and I was thinking that what this guy wants to do here is charge me. He wants me to be blinking and kick the gun and subdue me.
Martin says he pointed his gun at the man, and they stood there staring at each other until the man finally turned and followed his family up to first class. The pilot landed back in St. Louis. As soon as they landed, Martin says he ordered the women and children off the plane. He didn't want anyone on the tarmac to get too close, so they used the inflatable slide.
And then when that wasn't enough to get off, and there were still a lot of people on the plane, I told the stewardess to tell the pilot that anybody with heart problems, taking medication, or old, they can get off the plane too. So what the pilot did, he got on the intercom and he relayed that message. And unbelievably, everybody on that plane stood up and they were going to leave. 100% of them. Okay, they all had heart problems apparently.
He needed to think. In the end, he did decide to let almost everyone off the plane. But he kept 15 healthy men, along with the crew, as hostages.
Once we got all that done, they said, what next? And I said, well, we need to get this plane in the air and tell the pilot to refuel and take us up in the air.
The plane circled above St. Louis for almost 5 hours while banks and airlines scrambled to get together the $500,000. How are these passenger hostages doing? I mean, you were in the air with them for many hours. Were they in, what was the mood?
I think they were in good mood. I think the moods were good. I mean, they had no reasons to be apprehensive about any serious problems, I think. But, yeah, the passengers were okay.
At any point, though, when you were sitting there on the plane, were you feeling guilty? Were you looking at them and kind of wanting to say, listen, I'm sorry about this. I'm not actually trying to hurt you.
No, not at all. Of course I'm not trying to hurt them. I'm not trying to hurt anybody, myself included. That I didn't feel guilty at all.
Just after 9 p.m., the plane made its second landing at the St. Louis airport. The money was delivered in a leather mail bag and a small paper bag. Martin gave the flight attendants $2,000. He called it a tip because they'd, quote, been so nice through this thing. He had a few other demands: 2 shovels, flight goggles, 5 parachutes, 2 harnesses, and an altimeter. Around midnight, Martin released all of the passengers except for 1 hostage. The plane was refueled for another takeoff. Everything was on schedule.
And we are ready to take off. The pilot starts to gun the engine. We're rolling for takeoff. He starts to gun the engine, and then he stops, puts the brakes on. And he says, there's something on the runway. And he says, oh, my God, it's going to hit us.
A businessman named David Hanley had been watching the news of Martin's hijacking. He was sitting at the bar of the airport Marriott, watching the minute-by-minute updates about the hijacking on local TV. He told everyone at the bar to keep their eyes on the screen, got into his brand-new Cadillac Eldorado, and drove to the airport. He then drove through the chain-link fence around the runway and started driving towards the plane at 80 miles an hour.
80 miles an hour. Think of what's going to happen. The nose gear is going to collapse, and the plane, the cockpit and everything else is going to hit the concrete and the tarmac. A fully loaded plane, you can talk about a major explosion there, and I'm dead. Everybody's dead at that point. But what the pilot did, he slammed on the brakes, and the plane bounced twice. I moved up twice in my seat. I think at that point there, everything came to a stop, and I realized that we were really hit by some damn fool. We're going to have to order another plane.
We'll be right back.